Shalom, friends. Great to have you here with Rabbi Devin Maimon Villarreal to talk about Tikkun Olam, repairing the world, and what insight we can learn from the Talmud and how this phrase Tikkun Olam is used and how that might inform our Jewish social justice work. And as Rabbi Devin hints at, what he's going to move us towards is how it tries to move us from using that term as a catch-all to having a sophisticated understanding of it that can help to guide us more deeply. Because if all it means is repair the world, but nothing specifically, where does that actually move us to? Let me tell you about our scholar today, if you don't know him. Rabbi Devin Maimon Villarreal has worked in Jewish education for over 10 years as a classroom teacher in both orthodox and community day schools, during which he was awarded the Covenant Foundation's Pomegranate Prize for emerging Jewish educators. I was privileged to be there when he received that wonderful award. In his most recent past at DeLeT High School, he also serves as Jewish Studies Department Chair. Currently, he teaches as adjunct faculty at Hebrew Union College's DeLeT program for teachers and works as an education consultant for organizations such as the Sephardic Educational Center and the Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals. He's the author of the blog, thrivingtorah.com. I'll put that in the side so you can follow that, thrivingtorah.com, which explores the wisdom at the intersection of Judaism, education, and everyday life. At the center of all of his work is his belief in Judaism's ability to help people discover and nourish their best selves. Rabbi Villarreal, his wife, and 5 children recently relocated to Southeast Idaho. I didn't know that till I read your bio. Southeast Idaho, what a gift. Now when people say, who's the chief rabbi of Idaho, I can tell them. So, friends, this is really great. This is really great and really exciting to have this Torah and from this scholar. And in addition to his credentials as a scholar and as an educator, really the significance of his menschlichkeit, his humility and clarity of values. And you'll see that in our learning today as well. So welcome all of you who are here with us. We're thrilled to have you here, whether you're in the Zoom room or you're listening to recording. Rav Devin, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much for that enthusiastic introduction, Rab Shmuley. It's so great to be back with you, actually. So for those of you that don't know, Rab Shmuley and I actually were in Yeshivat together. We overlapped for a number of years, and we were just before the recording began, just sharing some fond memories. So it's really great. I am just in such deep admiration of the work that you and all of you are doing. Arizona Jews for Justice and the Valley Beit Midrash. This is just such a deeply needed thing, and I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to do some learning together with your community today. Those of you that are in the Zoom room, if you're able to turn on your camera, great. There's no pressure at all. I just want to make that invitation that if you were kind of wondering, should I turn my camera on, should I not? If you'd like to, please, I most invite that and welcome that. If it works better for you to have it off, then again, no pressure. It's just great to have everybody here, and welcome to everybody that is beyond this virtual space as well. And we're going to start off actually just by kind of, forming a bit of community. Rabbi Green, great to see you. Just by sort of just coming together, just by, sharing a little bit, about sort of like the worlds that are represented in this room, right? As is the case with any room with people. And if people just want to take a moment to put into the chat something that of significance that they want to dedicate this learning to right now, whether it's somebody's birthday or somebody who is in need of healing and you'd like to dedicate this session to a refuah shlema for them, any significant event that you would just like to offer and put into the space as we begin. Let's take a minute to do that now. A lot happening, right? Individually, on family levels, on global levels, and I appreciate people bringing that into this space. So we dedicate this learning to all of these things that people are mentioning here. And it's an opportunity just to remember that when we come together to learn, we really are bringing together entire worlds, people with varieties of experiences, perspectives, ideas, And that's something that is really important as we engage in study together. We'll be sharing different ideas. I'm going to be asking people for contributions in the chat. And so perhaps you'll see things that resonate with you, perhaps things that don't, but to always keep in mind as we go through this, that these are coming from perspectives and worlds and cares of a variety of kinds. And so just to kind of hold that as we enter in this learning together. I want to start by kind of framing the question that we're exploring today. This idea of sort of what does Tikkun Olam mean? And in particular for this session, we're going to be looking at how it's really experienced in the Talmud, at least one particular slice of that. And I just want to look at that question for a moment of, what does the Talmud mean when it says Tikkun Olam, or what is Tikkun Olam? I want to sort of, again, identify what kind of question it is that we're asking. And to kind of help us, think about that, I'm putting 3 questions into the chat. They're going there now, so you can take a look at them. So these are about the preamble of the Constitution, right? Just as an example. 3 questions are, what is the first line of the preamble of the Constitution? That's the first question. The second question is, what is the more perfect union in that first line of the preamble of the Constitution referring to? And lastly, the third question is, what is important to you about the preamble of the Constitution? And again, just as a reminder, right, preamble of the Constitution, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. Right, so let's just take a look at these 3 questions and let's think about it for a second. And what is the difference between these 3 questions? And if you have an idea, please pop it in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself and share. Let's take a minute to think about that. What is the difference between these 3 questions about the preamble of the Constitution?
I guess the question is, what is perfect?
Great. So the second question really has a term that is an open term, right? In terms of defining, right? Like, how do we define perfect? Distinct from the first question, which is, what is the first line of the preamble of the Constitution? Like, that's right there, right? Like the first line is what it is. Second question is, you're raising perfect. That's open to discussion. What exactly perfect means? Great. Thank you for that, Suzanne. And what about the third question? How is that different than the first 2 that come before it? Just any ideas that people have?
I would say, what's more important, perfect or union?
Great, right? And that actually is you raise something really important, which is it's a very evaluative question. And actually that third question that's actually the type that it's called. It's called an evaluative question. So thank you for that. So I want to raise this because it's important in terms of preparing our minds as we engage in a question to be aware of what kind of question we're asking. In education, there are so many different typologies of questions, but these are some that I find to be very helpful. And I'm going to put this into the chat just for people to see. But there are factual questions, which are answered explicitly by facts contained in the text. There is one answer. There is one correct answer, and it is explicitly stated in the text. There are also interpretive questions. Those have to be answered through analysis of multiple facts, drawing connections, context, experience. That's all necessary, and there are multiple correct answers. There are wrong answers too. It's not that there are no wrong answers, there are wrong answers, but there are multiple correct answers as it emerges from the facts of the text, the analyses, etc. And finally, we have evaluative questions. Those are entirely personal. It is about your experience. And so there are infinite answers, and there is no right or wrong, because ultimately it is about your experience. Right? And so I want to point this out. I see this comment. Oh, Eric, great to see you, man. It's been a while. Really good to see you. Thanks for being here. So just please also, people should be checking out the comments in the chat as they add to the conversation. You talk about covenant and binding of the whole people. Thank you. And when I talk about this question today about Tikkun Olam and what does it mean, I want to be very clear that what I am talking about is an interpretive question. And that's important because one of the ways that the discussion of what is Tikkun Olam has fallen apart is that it sometimes gets treated as either a factual question or an evaluative question. That is, either as having one explicit answer given definitively by a specific text, which it does not. And we see, though, this type of reaction coming from certain parts of the Jewish world, though, where Tikkun Olam has one definitive, explicitly given definition. But the truth is that's not the case. Or sometimes we find in different parts of the community, what is Tikkun Olam gets treated as an evaluative question, in which it is defined solely by the person using it and the issues that they care about, which is not right either, because texts do address it, and that means something, and it should mean something to us. And so today we will engage with exploring the question of what is Tikkun Olam, or more specifically, how is Tikkun Olam understood by the Talmud as an interpretive question, which will require consulting and being responsible toward texts, as well as our own analyses, sets of knowledge, and experiences. Particularly, we're going to take a look at this term and what it means in Talmudic texts and its authoritative readers like Rambam Maimonides. And I will offer my own textually grounded response to this interpretive question of how is Tikkun Olam understood in the Talmud. And I invite you to consider that interpretation seriously, as well as let it serve as a thought partner for your own interpretation based on the texts presented today and others you may be familiar with that I won't have the opportunity to address, or maybe text you know about that actually I am not aware of. So to start, though, let's take a moment and write down for yourself or conjure up in your mind your working definition of Tikkun Olam and what that definition is based on. And as we move through this text study, allow that to be in conversation with what we discuss today. Okay, so if anyone can just take a moment to do that, bring it forward in your mind or write it down. And again, just have that be present as we move through this text study today. So I'm going to give people a moment to do that, and then I'm going to start sharing my screen to begin learning the sources together. Okay, without further ado, we're going to jump into the sources. Suzanne, thank you for the comment in the chat. There is definitely a difference in usage, and that's one of the things we're going to explore today. In the Talmud, as you mentioned, actually, it definitely carries that sense with it, and we'll kind of unpack that and see what else we can discover. So, but thank you for framing that. Sort of, in some ways, that sort of like is like the starting point of a conversation like this, right? That there is that difference in usage. Okay. I'm going to put into the chat now a link to these sources. So if you would like to download them for yourself, or if you would like to be looking along, print them, etc., you can do that. I'm also going to be sharing them on my screen, which I am going to do now. So we're going to start off with the basics, sort of the locus classicus, right? The sort of primary example in terms of the place in the Talmud that Tikkun Olam gets discussed. And that's found in the Mishnah in Masechet Gitin, where we are presented with a variety of enactments that are motivated by Tikkun Olam. So let's just start there. And we're going to start with perhaps the most famous example as well. All right, so we have from the Mishnah in Gitin, right, Hillel hitkin prosbol mipnei tikkun haolam, that Hillel, right, instituted a document that prevents the sabbatical year from canceling an outstanding debt for the sake of Tikkun Olam. This document was called prosbol. And Rabbi Ovadia Mibertinoro explains that Hillel saw that people were prevented from making loans to one another, and they violated what's written in the Torah itself, which says, beware lest you harbor the base thought that the seventh year, right, when all debts are canceled, is coming. And so people stopped giving to each other because they didn't want their debt to be canceled and to lose money. And so really it was just putting people in a continually challenging circumstance, a harder circumstance, particularly those that were in need of loans. And so Hillel ordained the prosbol. And this is the body of the prosbol. The commentary explains, basically it was a document saying that I can still collect this debt. But again, in the end, ends up being a better thing because people will continue to lend to people who need it. So let's just, again, this is like, if you look in your textbook of like Tikkun Olam, right, in the Talmud, this is going to be the first example you get. What can we learn from it? So let's just go ahead and take a moment, and if people get in the chat or they should feel free to unmute themselves, what can we learn about Tikkun Olam just from this first example?
My first instinct is that it's saying that we need to make sure that the structures that we create and the structures that we live by are actually serving the real lived needs and the real just lived needs that people have.
Right. Thank you for that, Eric. Beautifully said, right? Like we create structures with a certain need in mind, but then sometimes those structures actually start to work against those needs. And what we see here is this ability, right, of the sages to say, listen, we need to be able to be nimble, we need to be able to be responsive and enact new legislation to make sure that the response to that need is still happening. Even, by the way, when that means going up against a Torah law, which it does in this case. You're supposed to let loans, be remitted, right? You're supposed to allow them to go void, right, in that seventh year. But if it's not going to end up serving the need, here we see a move from the rabbis to allow that need to continue to be served. So thank you for expressing that. We also see in the chat, right, where it says it seems to serve as a way for society to function better. Right, great, right? A similar point, right, but actually pointing out that it actually has a societal context, that we need society to be able to function in a certain way. It seems like this seems to want to help accomplish that. Right, great, Sally, thank you for raising that point. Seems like you might have to violate a Torah law for Tikkun Olam, right? And it's an interesting question about sort of like whether it is like a direct violation or simply not doing something you're supposed to do. And there's a little bit of nuance there, but it is really quite remarkable though, regardless, right, that we would actually bypass a Torah law, right, in the name of, right, sort of this value that we know kind of is motivating it. Great, and then Eddie, you have here like supporting the most vulnerable, right, and making sure the structures are actually supporting them. So I actually want to just sort of like hold on to that for a second, right, because we're going to come back to that, right? So thank you for expressing that.
And I was going to say one thing there.
Yeah.
When we talk about Tikkun Olam today, we normally mean, I think, the more radical pushing back against the more moderate. But what Chazal did here appears to be the more moderate pushing back on the more radical. The more radical is debt relief, cancel debt. And they said, actually, that's not going to work. We need to do something more moderate. So Tikkun Olam kind of, the rabbis are using it in the opposite way, you could suggest, right?
Yeah, for sure. In this way, right? And this isn't, always the case, but it's a great example where actually the Torah, even, 3,000 plus years ago, was too revolutionary, right? For the time even of the rabbis, and actually even now, right? So I think that's a great point. So somebody asked, what are the limits of bypassing Torah law for Tikkun Olam? It's a great question, and it's actually sort of like a shiur unto itself. And I would say that there's probably not a single answer to that. I would say that it's probably very case specific. But I would say that, looking at the sparseness, right, of Tikkun Olam in the Talmud, it actually doesn't come up all that often. I think it is sort of a tool that there was some hesitation about, with good reason, right? If we could just abrogate any law, right, in the name of sort of what we felt was the ideal, right? That's also not a stable system. So it's a great question. Thank you for raising those. So we're going to go because immediately the picture gets more complicated. Prose Bowl is given as an example because it's really pretty clear, right? Oh wow, here we see the Torah clearly had a motivation for canceling debt. But it's not working, and it's actually hurting people who need loans even more. So let's have an enactment, a rabbinic enactment that will address that. But the cases that are given afterwards get much more unsure about sort of what this is all about, at least as for us as readers. So let's take a look at the next examples. And then after this, actually, I'm going to ask for other people to read. So if you would like to do that, please, you should feel free to jump in. But in the very next Mishnayot in this same section, we have, in a case of one who sells his servant to Gentiles or even to a Jew outside of Eretz Yisrael, the servant is emancipated. Okay, the captives are not redeemed for more than their actual monetary value for the sake of Tikkun Olam. And one may not aid captives in their attempt to escape from their captors for Tikkun Olam. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, for the betterment of the captives, actually, that's why we don't help them escape, which is, the commentaries kind of really spend a lot of time on trying to figure out what this is about. And the Torah scrolls, tefillin, right, phylacteries, mezuzot, are not purchased from Gentiles for more than their actual monetary value for Tikkun Olam. So what is Tikkun Olam about here? What is motivating it? In Prose Bowl, it feels pretty clear, but we get to the next examples and already it feels less so. But can anybody extrapolate, even just from one example, what Tikkun Olam might be about in these cases?
It seems like the general sense of fairness that, we don't want to encourage, justice and fairness. I mean, you don't want to encourage people to steal your servant to get lots of extra money, and you don't want to pay more than something's worth.
Yeah, so thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, and it actually really seems like that is the common thread. There seems to be a common thread of there is a benefit in the immediate example, right, or in the immediate case, but there are unattended consequences which overall are harmful. And so we want to prevent that. The commentaries, for example, I think, the most illustrative example of this is with not helping captives, which for me, when I read that, I found to be very shocking, right? I remember the first time reading that, many years ago, being like, what is that about? And the commentaries talk about, well, because actually as a result of that, there are two perspectives, actually. One is that security around captives in general become tighter, making it harder for captives to escape. And so that's the unintended consequence, which we want to avoid. Or because when somebody escapes, it might be that the captives that remain suffer the consequences at the hands of the captors, right? They'll be treated more illy, right? God forbid they would be killed, etc. So it seems to be that there are these immediate cases that doing something positive in that moment has a larger unintended consequence, which it wants to be avoided. The rabbis wanted to avoid that And so they issue these mipnei tikkun ha'olam, right? So do these things or don't do things because they have unintended consequences, right, which we need to prevent. And that's really all the Mishnah gives us. There are actually many more examples going into the next chapter of the Mishnah as well. But we start to get this feeling of like, okay, it's a rabbinic enactment, that much we know. And two, it seems to be about thinking about how to preserve a larger structure of fairness and justice, even if that means that in the immediate moment act, right, not doing what feels like that. So there's something that happens. For the most part, this is where popular discussion of Tikkun Olam ends, which is something that to me is very surprising because there's really an extraordinary move that happens in the Gemara. And by the way, you might hear my children run in right now. So if you hear little kids yelling, that's what it is. And it's really quite phenomenal what happens in the Gemara and doesn't often get talked about. But for me, and for this presentation, you're going to see, ends up being the pivot point about how Tikkun Olam is understood in the Talmud and by authoritative readers. So let's go ahead and take a look. And it all starts with one case in the Mishnah that flies in the face of all of the other cases. So if there's anybody that wouldn't mind reading just the Mishnah portion of this next text of the evolution.
Hi, I can read it.
Thank you.
The court appraises land of superior quality, idit, for payment to injured parties for the sake of Tikkun Olam.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you. So what happens is that if I own something, in many cases like this, it's an ox, right? These are the examples that are given, and it does damage to your property, okay? When I have to pay you back for that damage, if I am deemed responsible for that, I don't just pay you for that damage. The best part of my land is taken to pay you back for that damage. And it's called idit in the pasuk, which we're going to see. It's very clear, but meitav haaretz, a person in this case has to pay from the best part of their land. Now, there is an extraordinary problem with this, which is the Mishnah is telling us that this is a law, mipnei tikkun ha'olam, which so far we've seen is a rabbinic enactment, and two, is supposed to avoid an unintended consequence. But this example completely flies in the face of both of those, because number one, the fact that you take from the best part of land to pay for damages is not a rabbinic enactment. It's an explicit commandment in the Torah. The Torah tells us this directly. And number two, it doesn't seem to have any unintended consequences that it's trying to address. And so the Talmud is stuck with this example that does not fit into any of the boxes than anything else does. And it's here, their response, that I believe we have a really phenomenal statement about Tikkun Olam. So let's see what it says. Julie, would you mind reading just this next part up until Tikkun Olam once more?
Sure.
Thank you.
From the Gemara, is this
Yes.
ordinance for Tikkun Olam? This is by Torah law, as it is written with regard to one who damages another person's property. Of the best of his own field and by the best of his own vineyard shall he pay. Exodus 22:4. The Mishnah is saying, what is the reason? That is, what is the reason that the court appraises land of superior quality for payment to the injured parties? This is for Tikkun Olam.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And so what just happened here is that what we're being told is that actually Tikkun Olam is not a rabbinic enactment, and nor is it to address unintended consequences. It is actually a motivation for Torah law itself. It is the reason why God gives specific commandments. God gives specific commandments, including this one of having to pay for damages from the best of property because of Tikkun Olam. And we have a baraita that sort of states this in an illustrating way. It says this as it was taught in a baraita that Rabbi Shimon said, for what reason did the Torah say that the court appraises land of superior quality for payment to injured parties? It is due to the robbers and due to those who take that which is not theirs by force, the hamsanim. How so? So that a person will say, why should I rob and why should I take by force? Tomorrow the court will come down to my property and take my finest field in order to compensate the victim for what I have robbed or taken by force. And the sages rely on what is written in the Torah. Of the best of his own field and of the best of his own vineyard shall he pay. Consequently, it said that the court appraises land of superior quality for payment to injured parties. And it is important to note that there's the Talmud, the printed edition that we have, states this slightly differently, but the commentaries arrive in the same place. I've provided the version that really states it clearly in the text itself. But here, this Baraita, right, this rabbinic teaching from the time of the Mishnah says very clearly, why did the Torah give this commandment? In order to Tikkun Olam, repair the world, which it defines here as preventing people who can take by force from doing so. So this is fascinating. We've gone from a rabbinic enactment to address unintended consequences, to know actually this is the reason for specific commandments. And what is the reason described by Tikkun Olam? The reason is to prevent people who can take by using power or force, to prevent them from doing so. Okay, so we're just going to pause right here. Does anybody have any thoughts or reflections or questions about this?
It reminds me a bit of in the American legal system that if you harm someone, you legally might not only have to, give them, rehabilitate the money that or the damage that you've done, but you also might have to pay some kind of punitive damages or compensatory damages on top of it, right? So you're suffering at a degree greater than that you have imposed on someone else, and that's supposed to be a further disincentive to harming others.
I did not realize that. So that's really, really very interesting, and a great example, right, of how an idea like this is translated into our own legal context.
It's very context specific. Sometimes it's the case, sometimes it might not be, but that principle applies.
Yeah, absolutely right. I imagine with so much of this, right, it is like all of the details of the case, right, and what the picture does that yield, and then is that an appropriate response in that case? But thank you for sharing that. Did not know that. So again, we have this remarkable turn. And by the way, for those of you who maybe you noticed, maybe you didn't, but I talked about, the basics and then the evolution, so for those of you that are into Pokemon, that's definitely a Pokemon reference. I apologize. I was a middle school teacher, and once you're a middle school teacher, you're always a middle school teacher. So here we are with this remarkable thing. So you might say, okay, so, the Gemara takes us in this direction, but it stops there, right? That's really not how we talk about it. That's not how it's generally understood, except it is in some really fascinating ways. So we're going to go now into some fascinating areas here, because once the Gemara opens this box and says, actually, Tikkun Olam is a motivation for certain Torah laws, then that opens the door for later readers to see that at work elsewhere, even when it isn't explicitly stated. So we're going to go ahead and read now another case from the Mishnah in Bava Metzia, dealing once again with civil law. And if there's another volunteer that wouldn't mind reading, somebody who, even if you have your camera off now, you're welcome to turn it on and read, or otherwise, anybody who'd like to read this next one.
I'll read it.
Thank you.
With regard to one who lends money to another and the debtor fails to repay it at the end of the term of the loan, the creditor may take collateral from him to ensure payment only by means of an agent of the court, not of his own accord. And he may not enter the debtor's house to take his collateral, as it is stated, when you lend your neighbor any manner of loan, you shall not go into his house to take his collateral. You shall stand outside, and the man to whom you lend shall bring forth the collateral to you outside.
Okay, thank you very much. And so we have this case where a permission is given to take collateral, but only when the court oversees that process, right, for a loan that has not been repaid. And that there are limits, though, to what can be done with that collateral. First of all, we know that from this Mishnah and from Psukim in the Torah, right, that actually if they were pieces that were essential to the owner, that you had to return those pieces of collateral. So that way they could use it, right? So that way they could stay warm at night. If it was a piece of work equipment, that way they could use it during the day. But also we see that the person who had lent the money could not just go into the house and take the collateral. They could not just do that. They had to be all done being overseen by a court. And so what we have here now is the Sefer HaChinuch, which was written in medieval Spain. And he's going to, as we'll see, he's going to also now take that Gemara, which opened up this door of seeing Tikkun Olam as a reason for certain mitzvot, and he's actually going to read it here. So he writes, first of all, he just gives a overall overview of this commandment of not being able to just come in and take collateral. He quotes the Mishnah we just read, right? If one lends to his fellow, he may not take collateral except through the court. He may not enter his house to take it. You must remain outside. And he writes, it is from the roots of the commandments that it is that so people not be as if abandoned and violence increased in the land, that the big ones swallow up the small one and take collateral from him by force without fear from him, and that the small one not be able to get his case against the big one from fear of his stature. And so the verse equalized them, such that one not take collateral for his debt from his fellow, but rather that it all be done according to the law. And with this, will there be a betterment in the civilization of the world, Tikkun Yeshivat Olam, as is the desire of its creator, that it be properly inhabited. So now what we see here, because the Gemara says, ultimately, this is the reason for the commandments. Specifically, what is the reason? So that the powerful not be able to take away from the less powerful, right, by force. And the Sefer HaChinuch now sees that in other commandments. Why can a creditor not go in and just take their collateral? Because that is a case of the powerful who are able to take away from the less powerful. And that is something that we cannot allow. And so there is this law, Mipnei Tikkun Yeshiv HaOlam. He adds the word Yeshuv, but it's this same idea of Tikkun HaOlam that is operative here. So now that we've come into this second example, by the way, Eddie, I appreciate your comment. I'm just seeing it now. Glad you're here for the Pokemon. What else do we learn from this example? Is there anything that just stands out to people, though, about this case and how the Sefer HaChinuch sees Tikkun HaOlam in it? Any reflections on that, either in the chat or on reading? Okay, I'm going to go on then for the sake of time. But what we're seeing is also, we're about to see, is that the Sefer HaChinuch is actually not alone in this. He is not an outlier. One of the greatest readers of the Talmud and codifiers, right, of its law in the Mishneh Torah is, of course, Harambam, Maimonides. And he starts actually to do, well, he came before the Sefer HaChinuch, but he does something very similar. And the way that he does it actually leaves us, I think, with an additional insight. The Sefer HaChinuch showed us how the Gemara's reasoning can actually be applied to other mitzvot. It's not just that the Gemara was saying it's this one mitzvah that was motivated by Tikkun Olam. Sefer HaChinuch says, no, actually other mitzvot are. He continues that tradition of the Gemara of seeing that as the reason. And finally, what we're going to see in Maimonides is an even larger expansion. So let's read together. First of all, the passage from the Gemara now in Masechet Sanhedrin reads as follows. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani says that Rabbi Yonatan says, any judge who issues a true judgment to the utmost truth causes the divine presence, the Shekhinah, to rest among Israel. As it is stated, God stands in the congregation of God. In the midst of the judges, God judges. And every judge who does not judge a judgment according to absolute truth causes the divine presence to withdraw from Israel. As it is stated, for the oppression of the poor, for the sighing of the needy, now will I arise, says the Lord. In other words, summarizing, God will arise and leave the people as a result of oppression. Maimonides reads this and paraphrases it in a most intriguing way in his law code. He writes as follows. He literally quotes this passage we just read from the Gemara. Every judge that issues a true judgment to its utmost truth, and then now he starts to add, for even 1 hour, it is as if that judge has repaired the entire world. Tiken et kol ha'olam kulo, has engaged in tikkun ha'olam. And that is what causes the presence of God to dwell in the midst of the people of Israel, as it is written, and then he continues on. So Maimonides looks at this passage of the Gemara, which talks about how any judge that judges rightly and fairly causes the presence of God to dwell amongst the people of Israel, and specifically what allows God to dwell, the fact that that judge did Tikkun Olam, Tiken et kol alum kulo, that when this judge does that, that is actually what allows God's presence to rest there. I want to keep an eye on time because I know I just have a little bit, so I just want to point out a couple of things. And lest we think Maimonides was on his own about this, the Tur, the great codifier after Maimonides, quotes him verbatim in this section here. Exact same language from Maimonides, but adds this preface, basing himself on Pirkei Avot in the last section of the first chapter. After the world was created, it is preserved through these things, justice, truth, and peace, that through judges that judge between people does the world continue, because were if not for the law, the powerful would conquer all others. And then he goes on to quote Maimonides. So it is the law that prevents the abuse of the powerful over those who are less powerful or those who are weak. And he adds that to Maimonides, seeing that any judge who does that, who judges rightly and therefore prevents that, is engaging in Tikkun Olam. I have another section here which just points to actually others have connected this Tur and Maimonides together before. So I just wanted to have that be present for people to notice that. And so we're in our sort of last couple of minutes, but I want to just sort of summarize sort of this journey thus far. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second and sort of see where have we landed. So following this line of thought, and there are others, again, this is an interpretive response. There are other texts we could look at that would paint, or I should say highlight a different facet. But following this line of thought, which is a clear one, we arrive at the conclusion that Tikkun Olam, as understood by the Talmud, is two distinctly possible things. A legislative tool of the rabbis to prevent harmful unintended consequences, harmful in the sense of working against the Torah's original intention, as well as, and perhaps more importantly, a core value which motivates the legislative force of the Torah itself. A core value which is the transformation of a world of oppression by the strong over the weak into one of equality under the law. A motivation that when at the heart of a judge's, and I would argue others' actions, render those actions partnership with the divine and an allowance for the divine to rest among us. So how does this inform justice work? There are, of course, many kinds of essential justice initiatives to be involved with. I would argue that what we explored today puts a fine point, though, on one particular aspect of justice work, and that is advocacy for laws that address power inequalities. Specifically, power inequalities in which the stronger can take from the weaker without consequence. To my mind, that squarely lands in areas of labor, including issues of gender, rights to organize, collective bargaining, and other areas, including immigration as well. Understanding the importance of protection of the most weak or those that are in the most vulnerable positions of society to protect them against those that could use their power to harm them or take from them without consequence. But there are, of course, other areas as well. What I put forward is what we use, like when we use terms like tzedek, tikkun olam, and chesed, we should do so with nuance and specificity. Doing so allows us to think with clarity about the various natures of the justice work that the Torah asks us to do, and reflect about how we might most effectively do them. I'll conclude with a pasuk that was already referenced in the Gemara, and it's significant actually, that is the minhag amongst we Sephardim, to recite the psalm that this pasuk is found in on the eve of Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah, embodying perhaps what the culmination of the Torah is all about. The pasuk says, Mishod aniim me'ankat evyonim ata akum, Yomar Adonai, ashit bayesha yafiach lo. Because of the oppression of the poor, because of the groaning of the oppressed, now I will rise, saith the Lord. I will set them on the safety for which they yearn. And so in any justice work we take on, be it Tikkun Olam, Tzedek, Chesed, may we be able to say that we work to do the same. Thanks everybody for your time today.
Yasher koach.
Baruchim to you.
Yeah, Yasher koach. Thank you.
Can I,
Yasher koach.
do I have time to make a comment?
Yes.
I was just thinking when you were talking about the unintended consequences, that, one of the interpretations of tzedek tirdof is that the means have to be as ethical as the ends. And that kind of made me think
Beautiful.
about that.
Absolutely.
Like I'm thinking about Afghanistan. Anyway, yeah.
Yes, there's a lot to think about there. Absolutely.
Thank you.
That's a great point. Yeah. And thank you for highlighting that. That's this value of sort of anticipating and being responsive to unintended consequences is in a few different places, right, in our tradition. Thank you for that.
I don't know if I could jump in and there was that text in which the wealthy could use their economic power to withhold the pledge, and I put it in the chat. I know you were rushing, but it just strikes me as the opposite of what we've got going on here, in which, wow, what a shrewd business person. They built this empire, and if they built it on the backs of the poor, like, well, okay, that's how you have to do it. But we've got a set of Jewish values that says that kind of wealth accumulation is it's a destruction of the world, and it's a breaking of the world that requires a healing of the world. And so, when we talk, you said it needs a specificity, right? Tikkun Olam, like, oh, we're doing we're picking up trash in the park, which is like, it's beautiful, that does visually, and maybe ecologically heal the world, but this is a very specific critique of a certain kind of exploitation economically. And I think we should be clear about that.
Yeah, thank you for expressing that, and I'm seeing now in the chat. And I really appreciate those comments and what you raised. And I think that, the way that you phrased it actually made me see something which I hadn't before, which is also, that very much what this helps us realize is that when the most vulnerable or the poor suffer, it actually isn't just the poor, it's a reflection of where our world is at. And if they are suffering and we are creating systems that enable that suffering, it's really the entire world that's broken. It's not just them that's suffering. And it's just sort of a matter of time until it reaches us in a way that we realize, but hopefully we are doing something about it long before then because of empathy.
Well, it reaches us because it takes God out of the world. I mean, what else? You can think of a stronger way of putting it. God is like, okay, I'm out of here. You guys can't handle this. Okay, goodbye. What a crisis.
And I think that that's fantastic. As beautifully said. And I think the other thing too that comes up for me with this is to remember that sort of like the vulnerable are us as well, right? If we're sitting in this room at this moment, we are probably not having to deal with some of these issues that are described, but we may have at some time or another, or very much people who are close to us or that are in our communities. And sometimes we act as a community as if, right, it is something outside of us, but it's really not. And even if it were, right, like as you're raising, it affects us in profound ways, which we need to be sensitive to. Thank you for raising that.
Can we get a link to these texts? These are very powerful.
As a PDF, or make a copy of it if you want to add to these sources for teaching that you want to do or to share. Please, by all means. Torah belongs to everybody. Well, again, I thank everybody for this learning together, and also just got the chance to see a lot of people I haven't seen in a long time, and also meet many wonderful new people. So I'm excited for that, and thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was
This was excellent. Thank you.
I love the Pokemon reference too,
Appreciate
personally. This was great. I love Rev Devin, and every time he just brings his amazing energy into all of his teachings, you just can't help but smile. Even though we were talking about subjects that sometimes are hard to even think about, like our fandom, how are we supposed to smile when we're talking about this repair, the need to act and stuff. But I think it's an important time to bring positive energy into the work that we're doing. oftentimes when we're looking at this repair, when we're looking at the work, especially here, like whether it be on a collaboration with DeLeT or Arizona Jews for Justice, there's also a personal strain. And I really liked what you said when you said we're also the ones that should need the support. You know, we're also part of that vulnerable community. And if you think about it, like that's how you can also step up and take care of your own mental health, take care of your own self to make sure you don't get burnout, to make sure that you're here continuing to fight. So that was just great. Alrighty, friends, thank you, everybody. I think if folks don't have any other lasting comments, we will go ahead and close our Zoom session. We appreciate each and every one of you who has joined us on the Zoom, watching us on our Facebook, and will be listening to this later on. We appreciate your support. Have an amazing day.